The alarm didn't wake me that Father's Day morning. I was already awake, staring at the ceiling with the kind of anticipation that only comes once a year. 57 years old, and I still felt that flutter of hope in my chest, like a kid on Christmas morning. The house was quiet, that peaceful silence before the storm of family life begins. I could hear birds chirping outside my window, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. I padded to the kitchen in my worn slippers, the same ones I'd had for 3 years, because I never bought myself anything new. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and I found myself smiling. Today was supposed to be my day. After everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, today my children would show me they remembered. They remembered who worked double shifts when money was tight. They remembered who sat up all night when they had nightmares. They remembered who never missed a single soccer game, even when my back was screaming from 14-hour shifts at the plant. The footsteps on the stairs made my heart race. Sarah first, then Marcus, then little Emma, not so little anymore at 16. They shuffled into the kitchen with that awkward energy of children who suddenly remember they're supposed to care. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," Sarah announced, holding out a small wrapped box. The others echoed the sentiment with forced enthusiasm. My hands trembled slightly as I unwrapped the gift. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were 3 pairs of plain white socks. The kind you buy in a convenience store when you're rushing to catch a flight. The kind that cost maybe $8 for the whole pack. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I looked up at their faces, expectant, already moving on to other thoughts, already reaching for their phones. Sarah was checking her Instagram. Marcus was texting someone. Emma was staring out the window. "Socks," I said quietly, more to myself than to them. "Yeah, we figured you could always use more socks, right?" Marcus laughed, that careless laugh of someone who's never had to think about the cost of anything. We pitched in together for them, $8. Split 3 ways, $2.67 each. That's what 27 years of fatherhood had earned me. As I held those socks, the memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. I remembered the winter when Sarah needed new boots for school, and I wore mine with holes in the soles for 3 more months. My feet would be soaking wet by lunchtime, squelching in freezing puddles as I walked the factory floor, but she had warm, dry feet walking to class. I remembered Marcus's baseball cleats, the expensive ones all the other kids had. I'd worked overtime for 2 weeks straight, coming home so exhausted I'd fall asleep at the dinner table. My wife would shake me awake, and I'd stumble to bed still in my work clothes, oil and sweat ground into the fabric. But Marcus had those cleats, and he hit 3 home runs that season. I remembered Emma's dance recital costume, the one that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. I'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day for 6 weeks, telling myself it was a diet, telling my growling stomach that my daughter's smile was worth more than any meal. And when she twirled on that stage, shimmering like a little princess, it had been worth it. 27 years of worth it moments. 27 years of choosing their needs over mine, their wants over my comfort, their dreams over my own sleep. I'd missed promotions because I left early for parent-teacher conferences. I'd turned down better jobs in other cities because I wouldn't uproot them from their friends. I'd driven cars until they literally wouldn't start anymore because every spare dollar went to their college funds, their activities, their endless parade of necessary things. The factory shifts had been brutal. 12 hours on my feet, breathing in fumes that made my lungs burn, operating machinery that could take a finger if I lost focus for even a second. But I'd done it gladly, proudly, because that's what fathers do. That's what love looks like. Not words, not promises, but sacrifice. Real bone-deep sacrifice that leaves marks on your soul. And now, sitting in my kitchen with $8 worth of socks in my hands, I wondered if they'd ever known. Had they ever understood what those overtime shifts cost me? Had they ever realized that when I said we can't afford that, I meant I can't afford that, so you can have this instead? The socks felt heavier than they should have, weighted with the crushing realization that all those sacrifices had been invisible to them. I was just Dad, the provider, the constant, the one who would always be there no matter what. They'd never had to wonder where their next meal would come from. so they'd never learn to appreciate the man who made sure it was always on the table. Dinner that evening was a masterclass in uncomfortable quiet. I sat at the head of the table, the same spot I'd occupied for 20 years, but everything felt different. The chair that usually felt like a throne, the place where I held court, asked about homework, mediated sibling disputes, and shared the stories of my day, now felt like a witness stand. Sarah chattered about her new boyfriend, the one who drove a BMW his parents bought him. Marcus complained about his summer job at the country club, how boring it was to just sit by the pool all day and occasionally hand out towels. Emma scrolled through her phone, pausing occasionally to show someone's vacation photos from Europe. I cut my steak, the one I'd splurged on because it was Father's Day. Even though my budget was already stretched thin from Emma's car insurance payment, and listened to their voices wash over me like background music. They were talking, but not to me. I was furniture in my own dining room, present, but not really there. "Dad, you're being weird," Sarah finally said, noticing my silence. "Are you okay?" I looked up at her, this beautiful young woman I'd raised, whose college tuition I was still paying off in monthly installments, that left me eating ramen for lunch. She was genuinely concerned, but in the way you might be concerned about a car making strange noises, worried it might affect your ride. "I'm fine," I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Just thinking." "About what?" Marcus asked, but his eyes were already drifting back to his phone. "About the time you broke your arm, and I held you all night in the emergency room because you were scared of the cast. About the time Sarah's boyfriend broke up with her via text, and I sat on her bed for 3 hours while she cried, telling her she was beautiful and perfect, and any boy who couldn't see that was an idiot. About the time Emma got stage fright at her piano recital, and I gave her my lucky penny, the one my own father had given me, and told her it would make her brave. Nothing important, I said instead. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, each second marking the growing distance between who I thought I was to them and who I actually was. The air conditioner hummed. Silverware clinked against plates. Outside, neighbors were probably grilling in their backyards, laughing with their families, creating memories that would be treasured and retold. Emma's phone buzzed with a notification, and she immediately picked it up, her face lighting up with whatever message she'd received. The excitement in her eyes, the same eyes that used to light up when I came home from work, when I had a new story to tell or a small surprise in my pocket, was now reserved for strangers on social media. I realized, sitting there in the golden evening light filtering through the dining room windows, that I had become a ghost in my own home. Present but not seen, providing but not appreciated, loving but not loved back in the same measure. The socks weren't just a thoughtless gift. They were a symbol of how little I mattered in the lives I'd dedicated mine to building. After dinner, I found myself in the garage, surrounded by boxes of memories I'd been meaning to organize for years. My hands seemed to move of their own accord, pulling out photo albums and keepsakes, searching for proof that it hadn't always been this way. There it was, a construction paper card from Sarah's second-grade class, covered in crayon hearts and glitter that still sparkled after all these years. "To the best daddy in the world," it read in her careful 7-year-old handwriting. Inside, she'd drawn a picture of us holding hands under a rainbow, both of us smiling stick-figure smiles that radiated pure joy. I remembered that Father's Day clearly. Sarah had been so excited she could barely contain herself, bouncing on her toes as I opened her handmade treasure. She'd worked on it for weeks, she told me proudly, staying after school to make sure every letter was perfect. When I'd hugged her and told her it was the most beautiful card I'd ever received, she'd wrapped her tiny arms around my neck and whispered, "I love you more than ice cream. Daddy, more than ice cream." Coming from a 7-year-old, that was everything. I pulled out another memory, a Father's Day breakfast Marcus had made when he was 10. Burnt toast, eggs that were somehow both runny and overcooked, and orange juice with so much pulp, it was practically a smoothie. But he'd served it to me on my grandmother's good china, wearing my old apron that hung down to his ankles, beaming with pride at his culinary creation. I made it all by myself. "Dad," he'd announced, standing beside the bed at 6 in the morning, the tray shaking in his small hands. "Mom said I could use the stove if I was really, really careful." I'd eaten every bite, praising his cooking skills like he was a 5-star chef. The toast had crunched like charcoal, and the eggs had the consistency of rubber. But it was the most delicious meal I'd ever had because it was made with love. Pure, uncomplicated, generous love. Then there was Emma's dance recital program from when she was 8, where she'd written in purple crayon on the back, "This is for my daddy who is the strongest man in the world and makes the best pancakes, and always knows how to fix everything that's broken." I'd kept that program in my wallet for 3 years, until it was so worn the words were barely visible. Every time I'd pulled out my credit card to buy them something they wanted, something they needed, something that would make them smile, I'd seen those words and felt rich beyond measure. When had it changed? When had I stopped being the strongest man in the world and become just the guy who paid the bills? When had my homemade pancakes stopped being the best and become something to rush through on the way to more important things? When had they stopped believing I could fix everything that's broken, including their own hearts? Maybe it was gradual, so slow I hadn't noticed. Maybe it happened the way darkness falls, not all at once, but degree by degree until suddenly you're standing in shadows wondering when the light disappeared. Or maybe it was sudden. A switch flipped when they became old enough to see me not as a superhero, but as just a man. Flawed, tired, ordinary. But as I sat there holding their childhood love letters, I realized the truth was more painful than either option. They hadn't stopped loving me. They'd simply started taking that love for granted. I'd become so reliable, so consistently there, that my presence had become invisible, like the sun or the air they breathed, essential but unnoticed until it's gone. Later that night, the house finally quiet, I sat alone in my living room with those socks still in their box on the coffee table. The television was on, but I wasn't watching. The blue light flickered across the walls, casting moving shadows that seemed to dance around my anger. $8. I kept coming back to that number like a tongue finding a sore tooth. $8 for 27 years of unconditional love. $8 for missed meals so they could have seconds. $8 for driving a car with a broken heater for 2 winters because Emma needed braces. $8 for working Christmas Eve so I could afford to make their holiday magical. I picked up the socks and really looked at them. Generic white tube socks, the kind with no cushioning, no special features, no thought behind them whatsoever. The packaging was already torn where I'd opened it, and one of the socks had a loose thread hanging from the toe. They hadn't even bought good socks. The rage hit me like a physical force, rising from my chest and spreading through my limbs until my hands were shaking. But it wasn't just about the socks. It was about everything they represented. It was about being taken for granted, being seen as an ATM with legs, being loved conditionally based on what I could provide rather than who I was. I thought about Sarah's boyfriend and his BMW, how she talked about him like he was a prize to be won. I thought about Marcus complaining about his cushy summer job while I'd worked every summer of my adult life, even when I was sick, even when my body screamed for rest. I thought about Emma's casual dismissal of everything I said, how she rolled her eyes when I tried to share my experiences or offer advice. When had respect died in this house? When had gratitude become extinct? When had I become the enemy instead of the hero? The breaking point wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no throwing things, no dramatic declarations. It was quiet, like the moment a bone snaps under pressure, a clean break that changes everything. I stood up, walked to my bedroom, and made a decision that would alter the trajectory of all our lives. I was done. Done being invisible. Done being unappreciated. Done giving everything and receiving nothing but indifference in return. If they wanted to treat me like I didn't matter, then I would show them what it actually felt like when I wasn't there. Not physically, I wouldn't abandon them. But emotionally, conversationally, relationally, I would withdraw. I would become exactly what they'd already turned me into, a provider without a personality, a wallet without a heart, a presence without a purpose. They wanted socks? Fine, that's all they get from now on. No more stories about my day, no more interest in theirs. No more advice, no more jokes, no more attempts to connect. I'd give them the silence they'd already created, but now it would be intentional. Now it would have weight. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror as I brushed my teeth, and for the first time in months, I felt something like peace. The man staring back at me looked tired, older than his years, but there was determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I was taking back my power in the only way I knew how. Tomorrow, the silence would begin. The next morning, I woke up and implemented my decision with the methodical precision of a man who had finally found his purpose. When Sarah asked if I wanted coffee, I nodded instead of saying, "Yes, thank you, sweetheart," like I had every morning for the past 5 years. When Marcus mentioned needing gas money, I left $20 on the counter without a word instead of asking about his plans or reminding him to drive safely. The change was subtle at first. I answered direct questions with nods or headshakes. I responded to requests with actions but no accompanying conversation. I ate breakfast while reading the newspaper, holding it up like a barrier between myself and their chatter. "Dad's in a mood," I heard Emma whisper to Sarah as they gathered their things for the day. A mood. As if my silence was weather that would pass, a temporary inconvenience they'd have to endure until I returned to being their reliable, talkative father. They had no idea this was a permanent climate change. At dinner that evening, my absence from the conversation created a vacuum that they tried to fill with nervous energy. Sarah talked louder than usual. Marcus made jokes that fell flat without my customary chuckle. Emma kept glancing at me, waiting for me to jump into the discussion about her summer plans, like I always did. But I said nothing. I ate my food, nodded when they spoke directly to me, and otherwise remained as quiet as furniture. The silence wasn't comfortable. It pressed against them like humidity, making everything feel heavier and more awkward than it should have been. "Are you sick, Dad?" Sarah finally asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern that might have melted my resolve a week ago. I looked at her for a long moment, this young woman who'd inherited my stubborn chin and her mother's eyes, and simply shook my head. "Not sick, just done." Marcus tried a different approach. "Want to watch the game later?" "The Cubs are playing," another shake of the head. We'd watched baseball together for 15 years, but those days were over. If he wanted to watch the game, he could do it alone or with friends who appreciated his company. The meal ended with an uncomfortable quiet that followed us into the living room. Usually this was when I'd ask about their days, help with homework, or share stories from work. Instead, I picked up a book, one I'd been trying to read for months, but never had time for because I was too busy being available for conversations that apparently meant nothing to them. They scattered to their rooms earlier than usual, probably to text their friends about how weird Dad was being. I didn't care. For the first time in years, I had a quiet evening to myself, and the silence felt like luxury. As I read my book, actually concentrating on it without interruption, I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage had crystallized into something harder and more permanent, indifference. And indifference, I was discovering, was far more powerful than anger ever could be. 3 weeks into my silence, the house had developed a strange new rhythm. Conversations happened around me rather than with me. Plans were made without my input. The family dynamic shifted like water, finding a new path around a stone. They adapted, but the flow was never quite the same. Sarah stopped asking for my opinion about her classes, her job, her relationship problems. She'd learned that questions received only nods or shrugs, so she started calling her mother instead, having long conversations on the phone that I could hear drifting down from her room. Sometimes I caught fragments, her voice thick with tears over some college drama or boyfriend issue, and felt a familiar tug to go comfort her. But I stayed put. She'd made her choice about my value. Now she could live with the consequences. Marcus had started working more hours at the country club, staying late even when he wasn't scheduled. At first, I thought it was newfound work ethic, but I slowly realized he was avoiding the uncomfortable quiet that had settled over our dinner table. The boy who used to regale us with stories about the eccentric club members now rushed through meals and disappeared. to his room or out with friends, Emma had begun spending most of her time at her best friend's house. When she was home, she wore headphones constantly, creating her own soundtrack to avoid the silence. She had always been the most perceptive of my children, and I could see in her sideways glances that she knew something fundamental had shifted. But she was 16, caught between childhood and adulthood, and didn't have the emotional vocabulary to address what she sensed. The silence wasn't just mine anymore. It had infected the whole house like a slow-spreading virus. They'd started talking less to each other, too, as if my withdrawal had broken some essential circuit that powered our family's communication system. Meals became exercises in efficiency rather than connection. The living room, once filled with debates about movies and shared laughter at stupid TV shows, now felt like a waiting room where people happened to live together. I watched it all with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a dying culture. This was what they'd wanted, wasn't it? A father who didn't intrude on their lives with questions and concerns and inconvenient care? A provider who stayed in his lane and didn't expect emotional reciprocity? But I could see the cracks forming. Sarah had dark circles under her eyes, the kind that came from stress she couldn't share. Marcus had started biting his nails, a nervous habit from childhood that had returned. Emma's grades slipped slightly. Not enough to cause alarm, but enough for me to notice when I saw the report card she'd left on the kitchen counter. They were feeling the absence of something they'd never consciously valued. Like people who don't realize they're dehydrated until they're already dizzy, they were experiencing the slow withdrawal of a presence they'd taken for granted. The house still functioned. Bills were paid, meals were cooked, laundry was done. But the heart had gone out of it, and still, none of them directly confronted what was happening. Pride, maybe, or the stubborn belief that I would eventually return to being their reliable, emotionally available father. They were waiting for me to break first, to crack under the weight of my own silence and come crawling back to my old role. They were going to be waiting a long time. By the 6th week, the first real crack appeared in their facade of indifference. It came from Sarah, who'd always been the most emotionally intelligent of my children, though she'd apparently forgotten to apply that intelligence to her relationship with me. I was reading in the living room when she appeared in the doorway, hesitating like she was approaching a wild animal that might bolt. She'd been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy in the way that meant serious tears, not just frustration or temporary sadness. "Dad?" Her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years, carrying echoes of the little girl who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared her. "Can we talk?" I looked up from my book, met her eyes for a moment, then deliberately looked back down at the pages. The words blurred slightly. Seeing her pain affected me more than I wanted to admit. But I held firm. If she had something to say, she could say it. But I was done pretending that talking was a two-way street in this house. "I know you're mad about something," she continued, stepping into the room but keeping her distance. "And I know it probably has to do with Father's Day. But I don't understand what we did wrong. We got you a gift. We celebrated with you, the gift. Those $8 socks that were probably still sitting in a drawer somewhere, unworn and forgotten." I almost laughed, but it would have been a bitter sound, so I kept it inside. "You've been different for weeks now," she pressed on, her voice gaining strength as she warmed to her argument. "You don't talk to us anymore. You barely acknowledge we exist. Mom says you're going through something, but this isn't fair to us, Dad. We shouldn't have to walk on eggshells in our own house." Our own house. The house I'd been paying for since before she was born. The house where I'd painted nurseries and built tree houses and fixed broken windows from errant baseballs. But it was their house now, apparently, and I was the one making them uncomfortable in it. I closed my book, marking my place carefully, and stood up. For a moment, Sarah's face brightened with hope. Finally, she must have thought, finally he's going to explain what's wrong and we can fix this and go back to normal. Instead, I walked past her without a word, heading toward my bedroom. But her voice stopped me at the foot of the stairs. "I got into state, Dad." Her words hit me like a physical blow. "Full scholarship. I found out yesterday, State University." Her dream school, the one she'd been working toward since sophomore year. Full scholarship, which meant all those hours I'd spent helping her with applications. All those practice sessions for interviews. All those nights she'd stressed about essays, while I assured her she was brilliant and capable, had paid off. This should have been a celebration. This should have been champagne and proud phone calls to relatives and a father lifting his daughter off the ground in a spinning hug of pure joy. This was the moment I'd been anticipating for months, the culmination of years of encouraging her dreams, and she'd been carrying this news alone for 24 hours because she no longer trusted that I cared enough to share hers. Happiness. I turned around slowly and looked at her. Really looked at her. She was standing there with tears streaming down her face, holding this incredible achievement like a gift she wasn't sure I wanted to receive. The little girl who used to run to me with every scraped knee and lost tooth and small triumph was now a young woman who'd learned to celebrate her biggest victory without me. For just a moment, my resolve wavered. The father in me wanted to cross the room and wrap her in my arms and tell her how proud I was, how amazing she was, how much I loved her. The father in me wanted to ask about her classes and her dorm assignment, and whether she was scared or excited about leaving home. But the man who had been reduced to $8 socks stayed silent. I nodded once in acknowledgement, not congratulation, and continued up the stairs to my room, leaving her standing alone with her tears and her triumph. Later that night, I heard her on the phone with someone, probably her boyfriend or her mother, sharing the news that should have been mine to celebrate. Her voice was bright with forced cheer, but I could hear the underlying sadness, the disappointment that her own father had greeted her greatest achievement with indifference. That's when I knew the silence was working. 3 months later, my birthday arrived like a reckoning. I woke up not expecting anything, my standards for family. Celebration had been permanently recalibrated. But what I found in the kitchen stopped me cold. The counter was covered with elaborately wrapped gifts. Expensive gifts, judging by the heavy paper and silk ribbons. A coffee maker that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. A cashmere sweater with tags that made my eyes water. A gift certificate to a steakhouse I'd mentioned wanting to try once, years ago. Worth enough to feed a family of 4. But it wasn't the monetary value that hit me. It was the desperate energy radiating from the packages. These weren't gifts. They were apologies wrapped in guilt and tied with panic. This was my children realizing finally that they'd lost something precious and trying to buy it back with money they didn't even earn. They stood around the kitchen like nervous defendants waiting for a verdict. Sarah still had dark circles under her eyes, but now they were accompanied by the hollow look of someone who'd been trying too hard for too long. Marcus kept running his hands through his hair, a tell from childhood that meant he was scared. Emma clutched a handmade card, the first one I'd seen from her in years, like a shield. "Happy birthday, Dad," Sarah said, her voice bright with artificial cheer. "We wanted to make sure you knew how much you mean to us, how much I meant to them." Past tense, apparently, since it had taken 3 months of silence for them to figure it out. I looked at each gift, examined the price tags they'd forgotten to remove, felt the weight of their expensive guilt. Then I did something that surprised even me. I smiled. Not a warm smile, not a forgiving smile, but the cold smile of a man who'd finally won a war nobody else realized was being fought. "Thank you," I said. And they all startled at the sound of my voice after so long. But those were the only words they got. I opened each gift with methodical precision, nodding appreciation for the thought and expense, but offering nothing more. No excitement, no gratitude, no warmth. I treated their desperate offerings like business transactions, acknowledged but not celebrated. Emma stepped forward with her handmade card, and I could see her hands shaking as she offered it to me. Inside, she'd written a letter. A real letter, pages of it, telling me about school and friends and dreams and fears. All the things she used to share with me before silence became my primary language. At the end, she'd written, "I miss talking to you. Daddy, I miss you asking about my day and telling me stories about when you were young. I miss feeling like I matter to you. I'm sorry we hurt you. I don't even know how, but I'm sorry. Please come back. Please come back." As if I'd gone somewhere, instead of being pushed out of my own family by their indifference. as if I was the one who'd changed the rules instead of simply adapting to the ones they'd established. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my shirt pocket. Emma's eyes lit up with hope. Finally, a reaction. Finally, some sign that I was still human beneath the silence. "Thank you for the gifts," I said to all of them, my voice steady and emotionless. "They're very nice." And then I walked away, leaving them standing in the kitchen with their expensive guilt and their belated realizations. I had somewhere to be, a fishing trip I'd planned for myself, because I'd learned that the only person I could count on for company was me. As I drove away, I could see them through the kitchen window, still standing there, probably trying to figure out what had gone wrong with their grand gesture. They'd thought money could solve what their neglect had broken. They'd thought expensive gifts could substitute for the respect they'd never learned to give. They were wrong, and now they knew it. 6 months have passed since that Father's Day morning, and the silence has become my superpower. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of intention. Every word I don't speak carries more weight than paragraphs I used to waste trying to connect with people who'd already disconnected from me. I still live in the same house, still pay the same bills, still provide the same material support. But I've stopped providing the emotional labor they'd learned to take for granted. I've stopped being their therapist, their cheerleader, their safety net for feelings and fears. I've stopped pretending that love is a one-way street that I'm obligated to travel regardless of traffic. Sarah calls now, sometimes twice a week, trying to fill the quiet with chatter about college and classes and boys. But I've learned the power of being an audience instead of a participant. I listen, really listen. But I don't offer advice they won't take or comfort they don't value. When she pauses, waiting for my input, the silence teaches her what my words never could. That conversation is a privilege, not a right. Marcus quit his job at the country club and found work at a construction site. Hard work, the kind that leaves you tired and grateful for simple comforts. He comes home now wanting to talk about his day, seeking the kind of connection he used to dismiss as boring. But I've retired from being his audience. He can learn about the satisfaction of work and the value of effort without my commentary. Emma has started leaving little notes around the house, on my coffee cup, tucked into books she knows I'm reading, slipped under my bedroom door. Each one is a small attempt to bridge the distance she never realized she'd helped create. I keep them all, but I don't respond. Let her learn that relationships require consistent effort, not occasional gestures when you finally notice what you've lost. The most profound change isn't in them, though. It's in me. I've discovered the peace that comes from not needing to be needed. The freedom of not constantly trying to matter to people who've proven I don't. The relief of letting go of expectations that were never going to be met. I've started taking pottery classes on Tuesday evenings. I've joined a hiking group that meets on Saturdays. I've been reading books I never had time for when I was busy being available for conversations that went nowhere. I've been living my own life instead of just facilitating theirs. Sometimes I catch them watching me with something like hunger, starving for the attention they used to receive without appreciation. They want their old dad back, the one who listened to every trivial complaint and celebrated every minor achievement like it was Nobel Prize worthy. They want the emotional availability they rejected, the interest they dismissed, the love they treated like furniture, but that man is gone, and they killed him with indifference. What's left is someone more honest, a father who provides what he's obligated to provide and nothing more. Someone who's learned that silence can be more eloquent than speech, that absence can teach lessons that presence never could. The socks are still in my drawer, unworn. I see them sometimes when I'm putting away laundry, and they remind me of the day I learned to stop giving myself away to people who didn't know how to receive the gift. They remind me that love without respect is just servitude, and I'm nobody's servant. My children are learning slowly and painfully that their father was never guaranteed, that the man who sacrificed everything for their comfort was a choice, not a given, that the love they took for granted was earned through decades of effort they never bothered to acknowledge. And me? I'm learning that the most powerful thing you can give someone is nothing at all. That silence, when wielded with intention, can echo louder than any words. That sometimes the greatest gift you can give ungrateful children is the chance to miss what they never knew they had. The house is quieter now, but it's my quiet. The silence belongs to me, and I've made it beautiful.